World Theory 2013 saying, in some cases, pulses are only generated and seen by a single client, right? I hope that I have that right. That's what I mean by local. No, that's actually all of the impulses. Impulses always happen just on one client. It's sort of like, running a piece of code. And you're like, only one person is actually kind of running that code. Actually, how to put it? Like, each sort of like, every time an impulse starts, it starts on a specific user and it's always gonna complete on that specific user. There's like no mechanism for that impulse to like, transfer to another user. Like that's not a like concept that the system has. There's ways you can kind of trigger, you can make something start another impulse on a different user as a result of like actions you do within the impulse, but that's not like, like a native mechanism. The impulse is always going to start on one user and it's going to finish for that user. You can have multiple users sending out impulses for the same, protoflags. So you can have multiple people kind of running impulses, but for each of the user, the impulse is essentially local. Like there's, at no point, like, the impulse becomes global in any way. The way to think about it is, impulses are almost like, that's like you're doing things. Like everything in Resonite, it's kind of described by a data model. It's like, it's like values and numbers and strings kind of describing what things are. And that part, Resonite, that part is global, like by default. Resonite will make sure that it'll stay in sync for everyone. When you do impulses are like actions. Like for example, an impulse, it can like, go into a node that modifies a value. So it's a particular user doing that action where, they modify a value. Once they modify the value, you're modifying something that's global, and Froox engine is going to make sure that modification is, replicated on other clients. But, that's kind of separate from the impulse because it doesn't care how that value got changed. It only cares that the global value got changed. But the impulse by itself is always kind of like local. So it's, yeah. Like, essentially, like, the best way to think about it is like impulses are, you have like, one shared data model. Actually, I'm gonna use the brush. Where did I put the brush? There it is. So if you like, think about it, imagine like you have the hierarchy, you have the scene, there's a bunch of things. And this is kind of describing your world. And you can think of this as shared. And then you have a bunch of users who can be doing things to it. So maybe like this user runs some impulses and the impulse will make modification and everyone will see that modification unless you've kind of driven this. And maybe this user will make modifications to this. And you essentially, each user is changing a shared whole. So it's like, like the impulses will always be happening on the user. And you can do a thing like where a user generates, like with the impulses, they modify a value, and then the code on another user will trigger impulse, which will change something else. Like that can happen, but like, that's not a direct thing. And technically that impulse that happens on another user, that's a new sort of sequence of actions that happen for a specific user. I hope this kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it's not like a typical client-server model, sort of, where like you have a, like let's say I push a button. That action is not sent to the server, which then handles it. Yeah. I handle it.
Resonite actually does, like, it's something that is called like remote procedure calls, like in, net programming. Resonite has no remote procedure calls. Like, it's literally built completely without them, and it's kind of built without them on purpose, because in big part it's, what allows us to do what Resonite can do, because everything's modeled as data.